Isabella could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. The boardroom, always a place of power and control, now felt like a trap closing in. Her father, Victor, sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, yet his authority undeniable. She had always prided herself on being his favorite, the one destined to inherit his empire. But today, everything was about to change. The future of this company rests on more than just your last name, Isabella, Victor said, his voice low but firm. You've had every advantage handed to you, but that has not made you ready to lead. You lack perspective. Isabella bristled, her cheeks flushing as the eyes of the executives turned toward her. She had never felt so small in her life. What are you saying, Dad? I'm saying, Victor continued, standing up and leaning forward over the table, that before you can lead this company, you need to understand what it means to work for it. Confusion flashed across her face. I don't understand. Victor didn't flinch. You're going to work for this company, starting today, as a janitor. The room went silent. Isabella blinked, certain she hadn't heard him correctly. You're joking. No, Victor said sharply. I'm dead serious. You will work as a janitor in our buildings for 1 year. If you make it through, the company will be yours. If not, you'll lose everything. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She had expected a conversation about her future, maybe a promotion, but not this. The thought of scrubbing floors, of working a menial job in the very buildings she once surveyed from penthouses, seemed absurd. She glanced around the room, but no one met her gaze. It was as though she had already become invisible. Is this some kind of punishment? She asked, her voice trembling. Victor's eyes softened for a moment. No, Isabella. It's a lesson. One you need to learn if you ever hope to lead with integrity. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was a public humiliation, and he was delivering it with calculated precision. She wanted to lash out, to argue, but she knew it would only make things worse. Isabella clenched her fists beneath the table, her mind racing. I'll do it, she said through gritted teeth, determined to prove him wrong. She would play his game, but on her terms. The harsh clang of the locker door echoed in the empty janitorial break room. Isabella stood in front of it, staring down at the neatly folded uniform, a stark contrast to the designer clothes she had worn just days before. The transition from the glittering boardrooms to this cold, sterile room felt surreal. The moment her father's ultimatum had been issued, she knew she couldn't escape it, and now, standing in the uniform of a janitor, reality set in. First day. A voice came from behind her. Isabella turned to see an older woman with graying hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She wore the same uniform, but carried it with an air of experience. This woman was no stranger to the work Isabella now dreaded. Yeah, Isabella muttered, not meeting the woman's eyes. I'm Janet, the woman said, extending her hand. You must be the new girl. Isabella forced a smile and shook her hand. Isabella. Well, Isabella, I hope you're ready for a long day, Janet said, giving her a quick once-over. It's not as glamorous as what you're probably used to. The sarcasm wasn't lost on Isabella. She had already resigned herself to the fact that people would judge her, and Janet seemed to be no exception. As they headed to their assignment, a sleek office building owned by her father's company, Isabella's mind raced with thoughts of revenge. One day, she would take over this empire, and they'd all regret looking down on her. Janet led the way, explaining the routine. We start on the top floors and work our way down. Bathrooms first, then hallways, offices, and stairwells. Simple enough, right? Isabella nodded, but the knot in her stomach tightened as they entered the building. The contrast between the opulent marble floors and the dingy janitor's closet where she stashed her personal belongings was impossible to ignore. Everything in this place screamed wealth and power. Everything she was supposed to inherit, now temporarily out of reach. By mid-morning, her hands were raw from scrubbing, and her back ached from bending over sinks and mopping floors. The luxury around her felt like a distant dream as she worked in the shadows, unseen by those who inhabited the pristine offices above. The door to the women's bathroom creaked open, and Janet poked her head in. How's it going? Isabella straightened up, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. This isn't as easy as it looks. Janet chuckled. No, it's not, but you get used to it. Used to it. Isabella couldn't fathom that. She was here to endure, not adapt. But as the day dragged on, the weight of her situation pressed harder on her shoulders. Every sneer from passing employees, every ignored greeting chipped away at her pride. By the end of the day, Isabella's hands trembled as she returned to the janitor's closet. Janet handed her a bottle of water. Not so bad for your first day. Isabella took it, her voice barely above a whisper. It was horrible. Janet shrugged. You'll survive. It'll get easier. Isabella wasn't so sure. She felt like she had crossed into an alien world, one where the rules were different and the stakes were much higher than she'd anticipated. The days blurred together as Isabella found herself settling, unwillingly, into the monotonous rhythm of janitorial work. Every morning, she donned the same uniform, took the same route, and scrubbed the same floors. Her manicured hands, now rough from cleaning products, seemed to mock her past life of luxury. The passing weeks offered no relief, and the thought of enduring this for a full year was suffocating. Janet, ever watchful, noticed Isabella's growing frustration but kept her distance for the most part. They had settled into a professional rhythm, speaking only when necessary. Janet didn't coddle her, nor did she offer much sympathy, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was waiting, observing. One afternoon, while mopping the long, sleek corridor of one of the upper floors, Isabella paused to rest her aching back. As she leaned on the mop, she saw her reflection in the glass doors of a nearby office. The woman staring back at her was unrecognizable, hair tied up in a hasty bun, face flushed from exertion, and eyes hollow with exhaustion. You're slowing down. Janet's voice came from behind her, breaking the silence. Isabella straightened up, blinking away her self-pity. I'm just tired, she admitted, her voice edged with frustration. Tired comes with the job, Janet said, her tone neutral but not unkind. She handed Isabella a rag and pointed toward a streak on the marble floor. Missed a spot. Isabella stared at the floor, her chest tight with resentment. Missed a spot. She had never thought much about the details before, about how someone's oversight could mean hours of extra work for another. As she bent down to clean the streak, she felt a small surge of anger, but this time it wasn't directed at Janet or even her father. It was directed at herself. She had been going through the motions, treating this year as a temporary inconvenience, something to endure until she could return to her throne. But the reality was sinking in. This wasn't just about cleaning floors. It was about proving herself. And right now, she was failing. The next few days, something shifted in Isabella. She began to focus on the task at hand, not just as a punishment, but as a challenge. Janet noticed the change, offering a curt nod of approval when Isabella finished tasks with newfound attention to detail. Slowly, Isabella started to find a strange rhythm in the work, a quiet satisfaction in doing something well, even if it was just cleaning. But the world outside the janitor's closet wasn't as forgiving. During one of her shifts, Isabella overheard a group of executives talking near the elevator. They didn't notice her, no one did, and as she quietly mopped the floor, she caught snippets of their conversation. Heard Anthony's making moves. Isabella's nowhere to be seen. Probably won't last the year. Poor girl's out of her depth. Their words stung more than she expected. Isabella clenched the mop handle, her knuckles white with the effort. The disdain in their voices reminded her of just how invisible she had become in her father's world. In the months following her father's ultimatum, Isabella's absence at the company hadn't gone unnoticed. Anthony, her father's ambitious right-hand man, had begun to maneuver himself into positions of power, capitalizing on her absence. He was charming, calculating, and ruthless, the kind of man who knew how to play the game, and Isabella had always sensed that his loyalty to the family was thin at best. Back in the boardroom, her father remained distant, keeping a watchful eye over the company's progress, but showing little reaction to Anthony's rising influence. Victor's decision to remove Isabella from the corporate scene had raised eyebrows, but no one dared question him directly. Even so, whispers about Anthony taking over grew louder. Isabella, for her part, felt the growing divide between herself and the company. The business world she had once been poised to inherit now felt like a distant memory. Every day, she walked the halls of the buildings she used to control, but now she was nothing more than a ghost in the background. The weight of her invisibility pressed down on her, a constant reminder that power, once lost, was hard to regain. One evening, as she sat in the cramped janitor's break room, scrolling through her phone, she stumbled upon a news article that stopped her cold. The headline read, "Isabella Thorne, heir apparent or heir forgotten." Her hands shook as she read the article, which speculated on her future with the company and hinted that Anthony was already positioning himself as her father's successor. The words felt like a slap in the face, and for the first time, she truly realized how far she had fallen. If she didn't fight for her place, there might not be anything left for her to inherit. Janet entered the break room, catching sight of Isabella's stricken expression. "What's got you all worked up?" she asked, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. Isabella hesitated before handing her the phone. Janet skimmed the article quickly, her expression unreadable. "Seems like they're writing you off," she said finally, her tone blunt. Isabella sighed. "They're not wrong. I'm stuck here, cleaning floors while Anthony's taking over." Janet sat down across from her, eyeing her carefully. "So, what are you going to do about it?" "What can I do?" Isabella asked, frustration seeping into her voice. "My father's already made his decision. I just have to get through this year." Janet shook her head. "That's the problem with you rich types. You think everything's just about getting through. Maybe your father's testing you, but that doesn't mean you can't still fight for what's yours." Isabella looked at her, surprised by the force of her words. "What do you mean?" Janet leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've spent your whole life being handed things. Now you've got to earn it. You may be stuck mopping floors, but you still have eyes and ears in this building. Don't let Anthony think you've disappeared. You might be in the shadows right now, but shadows can be powerful if you know how to use them." Isabella sat in stunned silence, absorbing Janet's words. There was a strange wisdom in her perspective, one that Isabella had never considered. She had been so focused on surviving the year that she had forgotten what was truly at stake: her future, her legacy. Isabella couldn't shake Janet's words. For the first time, she started seeing her position differently. Yes, she was still cleaning floors and scrubbing toilets, but now every hallway, every passing executive was an opportunity to observe, to understand the inner workings of the company from a completely different perspective. As she continued her janitorial duties, she overheard conversations between employees, things they wouldn't say in front of higher-ups, but freely shared when they thought no one important was listening. Isabella began to piece together bits of information. She learned about Anthony's underhanded deals, whispers of discontent among middle management, and even the frustration of lower-level employees who felt overlooked by the corporate machine. Janet had been right. Isabella was invisible, but that gave her access to information she never would have gotten otherwise. Late one night, after a long day of cleaning, Isabella sat in the janitor's closet, reviewing her notes. She had started keeping a small notebook where she jotted down anything she overheard or noticed that might be useful later. At first, it had been just a way to keep herself occupied, but now, she saw it as a potential weapon. Information was power, and if Anthony thought she was out of the picture, he was about to be proven very wrong. As the weeks passed, Isabella's attitude toward her work slowly changed. She stopped resenting the janitorial tasks and began to take pride in them. The work was physically demanding, but there was a quiet dignity in doing it well. She found herself talking more with Janet, asking her questions not just about the job, but about life. Janet, for her part, softened toward Isabella as she saw her earnest efforts. One day, while they were cleaning an office together, Janet paused and looked at her. "You're different than when you started." Isabella glanced up from her work, surprised. "Different how?" "You're not just going through the motions anymore. You care about doing it right," Janet said, her tone almost approving. Isabella shrugged, but a small smile tugged at her lips. Guess I'm starting to see things from a different angle. Janet nodded. That's the trick. Once you stop seeing yourself as too good for the work becomes something else. Something real. Isabella didn't reply, but the words stayed with her. She wasn't just scrubbing floors for a paycheck or to fulfill her father's ultimatum anymore. She was starting to understand the value in what she was doing, and more importantly, the value in the people who did this work every day. Her relationship with the other janitors also began to shift. At first, they had kept their distance, unsure of how to interact with the boss's daughter, playing at being one of them. But as they saw her working hard and not expecting special treatment, they started to accept her. Isabella learned their names, their stories, and began to see the faces behind the uniforms. One evening, as she and Janet finished up for the day, Janet handed her a cup of coffee. "You're doing good, kid," she said with a rare smile. Isabella felt a warmth spread through her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was earning her place. While Isabella continued to gain new insights from her work in the shadows, Anthony's influence over the company grew. He was charming, calculated, and every move he made was designed to cement his position as the next in line. His latest tactic was particularly underhanded. He had been quietly siphoning funds from various projects, covering his tracks so well that no one in the upper ranks seemed to notice. Except Isabella. One afternoon, she overheard two employees in the break room discussing some discrepancies in the budget reports. It was nothing they considered serious, but the numbers didn't quite add up. Isabella's ears perked up, and she made a mental note to investigate further. Later that evening, she went back to the janitor's closet, her heart racing. She had already gathered plenty of circumstantial evidence, but this was different. If Anthony was embezzling money, it would give her the leverage she needed to confront him. But she needed proof. Isabella took a deep breath and decided to take a risk. She knew the cleaning schedule well enough to know when certain areas would be empty, and tonight was her chance. Armed with her keys and a growing sense of determination, she made her way up to one of the executive offices, Anthony's. The building was eerily quiet, the soft hum of the HVAC system the only sound. Isabella's pulse quickened as she approached Anthony's office. She hadn't set foot in these upper floors since she had been cast out, and the familiar opulence now felt foreign, even unsettling. Carefully, she unlocked the door to his office and slipped inside. The space was as pristine and calculated as Anthony himself. Everything in its place, no sign of the chaos brewing beneath the surface. Isabella sat at his desk, turning on the computer. As she searched through files, her eyes widened. She found evidence of several unauthorized transfers, all cleverly hidden under different project codes. It was a sophisticated scheme, but now she had the proof she needed. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Isabella's heart leapt into her throat. She scrambled to close the files and shut down the computer. The door handle rattled, and she barely had time to hide behind the desk before the door opened. Through the small gap between the desk and the floor, Isabella saw a pair of polished shoes step into the office. Anthony's voice drifted in, speaking to someone on the phone. "Everything's going as planned. Thorne's daughter is out of the way, and Victor's too distracted to notice what's happening. By the time anyone realizes, it'll be too late." Isabella clenched her fists, her mind racing. She needed to get out, but not before she heard every word. Once the final transfer goes through, we'll be able to pin this on the old man. No one will question it. The board's already looking for an excuse to push him out. Isabella's blood ran cold. Anthony wasn't just trying to take over. He was planning to ruin her father and take the company for himself. After what felt like an eternity, Anthony finally left the office. Isabella waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before slipping out the door and making her way back to the janitor's closet. Her hands trembled as she locked the door behind her. She had the proof she needed, but the stakes had just risen dramatically. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her father's entire legacy was on the line. The weight of her discovery pressed heavily on Isabella as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. Anthony's plan wasn't just about seizing control. It was about dismantling her father's empire from within. The thought of losing everything, Not just her inheritance, but the family legacy, sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't keep this to herself. But who would believe her? She was just a janitor now, invisible to the people in power. Her father had placed her on the outskirts of the company for a reason, and barging into the boardroom with accusations would do more harm than good. She needed a plan, a way to expose Anthony without jeopardizing what little trust she still had. The next morning, Isabella met Janet at their usual station. Janet glanced at her, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. Rough night. Isabella nodded, biting her lip. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to confide in Janet, but something inside her pushed her to speak. I found something bad. Janet raised an eyebrow. Bad how? I think Anthony is stealing money from the company, Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. And he's planning to frame my father. Janet's expression darkened. You sure about this? Isabella nodded, her heart racing. I found the files. I overheard him talking about it. Janet sighed, wiping her hands on a rag. Well, that's a mess. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, Isabella admitted, her voice trembling. If I tell my father, he might not believe me. And even if he does, Anthony's already got people in his pocket. I need a way to prove it to the board. Janet was silent for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she considered the situation. You're in a tough spot, no doubt, but you've got one thing going for you. Nobody sees you coming. You're a ghost to them now, and that's your advantage. Isabella looked at her, confused. What do you mean? Janet leaned closer, her voice low. You've been listening, watching. You know more about this place than most of those suits upstairs. If you're smart, you can use that to your advantage. Get the proof you need, and bring it to the right people. A flicker of hope stirred in Isabella's chest. Janet was right. She had been learning the inner workings of the company from the ground up, and no one was paying attention to her movements. She had access to places and conversations that Anthony couldn't control. She wasn't powerless. She just had to play her cards right. Over the next few days, Isabella began to gather more evidence. She used her position as a janitor to quietly move through the building, listening in on conversations, checking files, and piecing together the puzzle. With every bit of information she uncovered, the scope of Anthony's plot became clearer. He was siphoning off funds from multiple projects, and he had key people in the company either unaware or complicit. The more Isabella learned, the more determined she became. This was no longer just about proving herself to her father. It was about saving the company and the people who worked for it, from the janitors to the executives. Anthony's greed would destroy everything if she didn't act soon. One evening, after a particularly long day, Isabella sat with Janet in the break room, her notebook open in front of her, filled with scribbled notes and ideas. I think I'm ready, Isabella said, her voice steady despite the knot of nerves in her stomach. I have enough to take this to the board. Janet looked at her, a glint of approval in her eyes. Good. Just remember, this isn't going to be easy. Anthony's a snake, and he's not going to go down without a fight. Isabella nodded. I know, but I'm ready. Isabella's plan was in motion. She spent the next week quietly gathering the final pieces of evidence, preparing to confront Anthony and expose his scheme. But as she worked, something unexpected began to happen. Her relationships with the other janitors deepened. She had already earned a degree of respect from Janet, but now the other workers started to see her differently too. They had been watching her, noting how she didn't shy away from the hard work, how she listened to their stories and treated them with respect. She was no longer the boss's daughter playing a role. She was becoming one of them. One afternoon, as Isabella was cleaning a hallway, a janitor named Carlos approached her. He had been quiet and reserved since she started, but today, there was a soft smile on his face. You're doing good work, he said, nodding toward the floor she had just mopped. Isabella smiled back, surprised by the compliment. Thanks. Carlos hesitated for a moment, then glanced around to make sure no one was listening. I heard about Anthony, he said in a low voice. Janet mentioned you've been looking into him. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized Janet had told anyone, but she quickly recovered. Yeah, I am. He's planning something big, and it's not good. Carlos nodded grimly. A lot of us have noticed things. The way money moves, the way people talk. We don't have the power to stop it, but we see it happening. Isabella leaned in closer. Do you have anything concrete? Anything that could help? Carlos hesitated again, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. I don't know if this will help, but I've been keeping records. Invoices, payments, things that don't add up. I've been doing it for a while, just in case. Isabella took the flash drive, her hands trembling slightly. This could be exactly what I need. Thank you, Carlos. He shrugged, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. We've all got to look out for each other. Anthony doesn't care about people like us, but you're different. Isabella felt a lump form in her throat. She had never expected to find allies among the janitors, but now she realized just how much she had underestimated them, and herself. That night, Isabella reviewed the contents of the flash drive. Carlos had been meticulous, documenting every suspicious transaction he could find. The evidence was overwhelming. She finally had what she needed to expose Anthony once and for all. But there was one more thing she had to do before she could take this to the board. She needed to confront her father. Isabella knew that her relationship with her father had been strained since the ultimatum, but she couldn't go into this battle without at least trying to make him understand what was at stake. If she could get him on her side, they would have a much stronger case against Anthony. The next morning, Isabella made her way to her father's office. The door was closed, and for a moment, she hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. But she couldn't back down now. She knocked, then pushed the door open. Victor looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. Isabella, what are you doing here? I need to talk to you, she said, closing the door behind her. It's about Anthony. Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded as he listened to Isabella's words. She laid out the evidence she had gathered, the notes, the flash drive from Carlos, and the details of Anthony's embezzlement scheme. Her voice was steady, but inside, she was a mix of nerves and determination. This moment was crucial, not just for the company, but for her relationship with her father. For a long time, Victor said nothing. He flipped through the documents Isabella had printed out, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silence in the office felt oppressive, and Isabella struggled to keep her composure. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. You've done your homework, I'll give you that. Isabella felt a flicker of hope, but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. I had my suspicions about Anthony, Victor admitted, setting the papers down. He's ambitious, too much for his own good, but I didn't think he'd go this far. Isabella exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. So, you believe me? Victor nodded, his expression softening slightly. Yes, I believe you, but this isn't just about believing. We need to handle this carefully. Anthony has connections, and if we move too quickly, he'll find a way to slip through our fingers. We have enough evidence to bring this to the board, Isabella pressed. We could stop him before he does any more damage. Victor stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline. You're right, but timing is everything. We need to make sure that when we move, it's a knockout blow. Isabella joined him at the window, her mind racing. Then we need to act soon. He's planning one final transfer, and after that, it'll be too late. Victor turned to face her, his eyes sharp. You've grown, Isabella. I see it now. You're not the same girl who walked into that boardroom months ago. Isabella met his gaze, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. For so long, she had been fighting not just for the company, but for her father's respect. And now, finally, it seemed she had earned it. Victor walked back to his desk and picked up the phone. I'm calling a board meeting for tomorrow morning. We'll expose Anthony and end this. The boardroom was filled with tension the next morning as the company's top executives gathered around the long, polished table. Isabella sat next to her father, her hands resting on the evidence they had prepared. Across from her, Anthony sat with his usual smug smile, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. As the meeting began, Victor wasted no time in getting to the point. We've gathered here today because there are serious concerns about the financial health of this company. Over the past few months, We've discovered discrepancies in several key projects. Anthony's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. I'm sure any discrepancies can be explained. We've been expanding rapidly, and with that comes some logistical issues. Victor nodded, his face unreadable. Perhaps. But we've also found evidence of unauthorized transfers. Funds have been moved from one account to another, hidden under false project names. Anthony's eyes flickered with unease, but he maintained his composure. I'm sure there's an explanation for that. We've been restructuring, and some funds have been reallocated. That's not what this is, Isabella cut in, her voice firm. All eyes turned to her, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of the room's attention. We have proof that you've been embezzling money, Anthony. You've been siphoning off funds for months, and you've covered your tracks by framing these transfers as project expenses. A stunned silence followed her words. Anthony's face paled, but his expression quickly turned to one of defiance. That's ridiculous, he said, his voice tight. You're grasping at straws, Isabella. You've been out of the company for months. How could you possibly know what's going on? I know more than you think, Isabella replied, standing. She reached into her bag and pulled out the documents, laying them on the table. These are the records of the unauthorized transfers. They match up with the projects you've been overseeing. And here, she slid the flash drive across the table, are the digital records, proving that you've been moving money into offshore accounts. Anthony glanced at the flash drive, his face betraying a flicker of panic. But he wasn't ready to give up. This is absurd. Anyone could have fabricated these records. You don't have real proof. I overheard you, Isabella said, cutting him off again. I was in your office when you were talking on the phone. You said yourself that you planned to frame my father. The room was deathly quiet as the weight of Isabella's words settled over the group. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances, but it was clear that Anthony's position was crumbling. Victor leaned forward, his eyes locked on Anthony. You're done, Anthony. We're calling for an immediate audit of all your projects. If the audit confirms what we already know, you'll be facing charges for embezzlement and fraud. Anthony's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Isabella thought he might lash out. But instead, he stood, his fists clenched at his sides. You're making a mistake, he hissed. You think you've won, but this isn't over. Without another word, Anthony stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but it was also filled with a sense of relief. Isabella felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had done it. Anthony was exposed, and the company was safe. For now, Victor turned to her, his expression one of quiet pride. You handled yourself well, Isabella. You've earned your place here. Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in a long time. But even as she savored the victory, she knew this wasn't the end. Anthony wasn't going to go down without a fight, and there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time, Isabella felt ready to face them. The boardroom remained still long after Anthony had stormed out, the echo of the door slamming resonating in Isabella's mind. Her heart still raced from the intensity of the confrontation, but a quiet victory settled in her chest. She had done what she set out to do. Her father was safe, the company was out of immediate danger, and Anthony's plot had been exposed. But as the board members began murmuring amongst themselves, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Anthony's last words hung in the air like a dark cloud. This isn't over. She knew him well enough to understand that he wasn't a man who gave up easily. Victor stood and addressed the room, his voice calm but commanding. I want a full audit of all current and past projects under Anthony's management. Notify our legal team to start preparing for the investigation. The board members nodded in agreement, exchanging nervous glances, but no one questioned Victor's authority. As the meeting adjourned and the executives filtered out, Victor turned to Isabella. You did well today, he said, his tone softer than usual. There was no longer any trace of the distant, skeptical father she had known months ago. Now, he looked at her with genuine respect. Thanks, Isabella replied, though her thoughts were still lingering on the bigger picture. But we're not done yet. Anthony won't go down quietly. Victor's face hardened. I know. That's why we have to stay ahead of him. We've exposed his embezzlement, but there's no telling what else he's planning. Isabella nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't let her guard down now. Anthony had resources, and even though his scheme had been uncovered, he still had influence, and likely some dangerous tricks up his sleeve. She had to be ready for whatever came next. Later that night, as Isabella was leaving the office, Janet caught up with her. So how'd it go? She asked, her eyes scanning Isabella's face for any signs of trouble. We exposed him, Isabella said, letting out a sigh of relief. Anthony's finished. Janet studied her for a moment, her brow furrowed. But Isabella hesitated, then shook her head. But I don't think he's done fighting. He's angry, and men like Anthony don't walk away without a plan. I just don't know what he's going to do next. Janet crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. Well, you've got one thing going for you. You're still in the shadows. He may not see your next move coming. Just keep your eyes open, and don't let your guard down. Isabella nodded, appreciating the advice. I won't. I can't afford to. The next few days passed in a blur of audits, meetings, and preparations for the legal battle ahead. Isabella worked alongside her father, helping to organize the evidence against Anthony and ensuring that all loose ends were tied up. The company's legal team was preparing to file charges, and everything seemed to be falling into place. But Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One afternoon, while reviewing some final paperwork in the janitor's break room, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello. A familiar voice, smooth and laced with malice, came through the line. Isabella. Her blood ran cold. Anthony. You didn't really think you'd won, did you? He sneered. Exposing a few financial discrepancies won't be enough to stop me. I have more influence in this company than you realize. Isabella's grip tightened on the phone. It's over, Anthony. You've lost. You'll be lucky to avoid prison after what you've done. Anthony chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. Prison. Oh, I'm not worried about that. You see, Isabella, the people in power are the ones who control the narrative. And right now, I control more than you know. Isabella's stomach twisted. What do you want? What I've always wanted, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Control. And I'm not going to let a spoiled little girl stand in my way. Her heart pounded in her chest. You'll never get away with this. We'll see, he replied, and the line went dead. Isabella sat frozen, her mind racing. Anthony wasn't bluffing. He still had cards to play, and whatever he was planning next, it was going to be big. Isabella knew that she couldn't wait for Anthony to make his next move. He was dangerous, and the longer she let him operate in the shadows, the more damage he could do. She needed to act quickly and decisively. That night, she stayed late at the office, combing through old files and records, looking for anything she might have missed. The evidence they had gathered was strong, but if Anthony still had allies within the company, he could manipulate the situation to his advantage. She needed something that would completely dismantle his influence. Hours passed, and just as Isabella was about to give up for the night, she found it. Buried deep within the financial records was a trail of documents that linked Anthony to an offshore account, one that wasn't just for embezzlement. It was connected to a series of illegal deals that went beyond just siphoning company funds. These deals involve insider trading and bribery, the kind of crimes that could not only ruin Anthony, but send him to prison for life. Her heart raced as she copied the documents to a secure drive. This was it. This was the final piece she needed to bring him down once and for all. The next morning, Isabella didn't waste any time. She went straight to her father's office and laid out the new evidence in front of him. Victor's eyes scanned the papers, his expression growing darker with every page. This is it, he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of anger and resolve. This is enough to destroy him. Isabella nodded. I thought we should take this straight to the authorities. If we wait any longer, Anthony might find a way to cover his tracks. Victor agreed. They called an emergency meeting with the legal team, and by the end of the day, they had everything in place. The documents were handed over to the authorities, and a warrant was issued for Anthony's arrest. Isabella felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The battle had taken its toll on her. She had spent months fighting in the shadows, working to prove herself and protect the company, and now that it was over, she felt different. Her father noticed the change in her, too. After the dust settled and the charges were filed, he called her into his office. "You've proven yourself," Victor said, his voice full of pride. "You've earned your place here. The company is yours, Isabella." But as the words left his mouth, Isabella felt an unexpected hesitation. She had spent so long fighting for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if it was what she truly wanted anymore. "I appreciate that," Isabella said, her voice quiet. "But I've changed. I'm not sure if this is the life I want." Victor looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I've learned a lot these past few months," she said, meeting his gaze. "Not just about the company, but about myself. And I'm not the same person I was when this all started. I think I need time to figure out what comes next for me." Victor was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "I understand. You've earned that time." Isabella smiled, a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had won the battle, but more importantly, she had found herself in the process. The days following Anthony's arrest were a whirlwind of press conferences, legal proceedings, and internal meetings. The company had narrowly avoided disaster, and thanks to Isabella's efforts, the worst had been prevented. Anthony's influence had been eradicated, his supporters within the company exposed and either fired or forced to step down. Isabella, however, felt a strange emptiness amidst the chaos. She had spent months fighting for this victory, but now that it was hers, the triumph didn't feel as satisfying as she had imagined. She watched from the sidelines as her father led the press conferences, addressing the company's future and reassuring the world that Thorne Enterprises would come out of this stronger than ever. Despite her pivotal role in saving the company, Isabella found herself retreating more and more into the background. She attended the meetings, smiled for the cameras when necessary, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. The thrill of the corporate world had faded, replaced by a deeper understanding of what truly mattered to her. Janet noticed the shift. One evening, after a particularly long day of press interviews, she found Isabella sitting in the janitor's break room, staring down at her hands. "You don't look like someone who just saved a multi-billion-dollar company," Janet said, leaning against the doorframe. Isabella smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I guess I thought it would feel different." Janet nodded, sitting down across from her. "You've been through a lot. It's normal to feel a little lost after something like this." "I thought this was what I wanted," Isabella admitted, her voice soft. "I thought if I saved the company, if I proved myself, I'd finally be happy. But now, I don't know." Janet studied her for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's because you're not the same person who walked into that boardroom months ago. You've changed, Isabella. You've learned what it means to work for something, to fight for it. But now, you've got to figure out what you want, not what everyone else expects from you." Isabella looked down at her hands, the calluses from months of hard work still visible. She had grown in ways she hadn't expected, and now, the idea of stepping into her father's shoes felt less like a dream and more like a burden. She had proven herself, but did she want to live a life defined by power and wealth? "I think you're right," Isabella said quietly. "I need to figure out what comes next, for me." As the weeks passed, Isabella began to pull back from her responsibilities at the company. Her father noticed the change, but didn't push her. He seemed to understand that she needed time to process everything that had happened. One afternoon, Victor called her into his office. He looked more relaxed than she had seen him in months, the weight of the company's survival no longer pressing down on his shoulders. "I've been thinking," Victor said, leaning back in his chair. "You've done more for this company than I could have ever asked for. You've proven yourself beyond any doubt. But I can see that your heart isn't in it anymore." Isabella nodded, relieved that he had noticed. "I don't think this is what I want, Dad. Not right now. At least." Victor smiled softly. "That's okay. You've earned the right to choose your own path. The company will always be here, and if you ever want to come back, the door is open." But if you need time to find yourself, take it." A wave of gratitude washed over Isabella. "Thank you. I don't know what's next for me, but I know I need to figure out on my own terms." Victor stood and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you. You've grown into someone I respect, not just as my daughter, but as a person." Isabella smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "That means more to me than you know." Isabella spent the next few weeks away from the office, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She took long walks through the city, observing the people, the buildings, the hustle and bustle that had once defined her life. She no longer felt the need to control it all. Instead, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. But just as she was settling into this new sense of calm, an unexpected visitor arrived at her door. It was a rainy afternoon when the knock echoed through her small apartment. Isabella opened the door to find a man standing there, drenched from the rain, but with an air of urgency about him. He was tall, with graying hair and sharp features that gave him an air of authority. "Isabella Thorne?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Yes, that's me," she replied, unsure of who he was. The man pulled out a small envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to her. "This is from someone who worked closely with your father years ago. He's been watching everything that's happened with Anthony and the company." Isabella frowned, taking the envelope. "Who are you?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let's just say I'm a friend. You'll find everything you need inside." Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the rain, leaving Isabella standing in the doorway, confused and uneasy. She closed the door and opened the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a single letter, written in neat, precise handwriting. The contents of the letter chilled her to the bone. "Isabella, you may have stopped Anthony, but there's a larger threat looming over Thorne Enterprises. Your father's past is about to come back to haunt him, and the company may not survive it. If you want to protect everything your family has built, you'll need to act fast. I'll be in touch." Isabella's heart raced as she read and reread the letter. What could this be about? Her father had never mentioned any enemies from his past, but if this letter was to be believed, there was a new threat, one even more dangerous than Anthony had been. She quickly called her father, her mind spinning with possibilities. "Dad, I just got a letter from someone who claims to know about a threat to the company," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "Do you know anything about this?" Victor was silent on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice was grim. "I was hoping this wouldn't resurface, but it seems we're not done with old ghosts. What's going on?" Isabella pressed. "There are things I've kept from you, from everyone," Victor admitted. "Decisions I made years ago, deals I thought were long buried, but it seems someone has decided to dig them up. Who? And why now?" "I'm not sure," Victor said, "but whoever sent you that letter knows more than they should. This could destroy everything we've built." Isabella felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had thought the worst was behind them, but now it seemed like an even bigger storm was brewing. She had walked away from a company to find herself, but now it seemed she would have to face this new challenge head-on. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "We prepare," Victor replied, "and this time, we fight together." Isabella hung up the phone, her mind racing. She had thought her journey was over, but it seemed that a new chapter was just beginning, one that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But this time, she wasn't the naive, entitled girl who had walked into the boardroom months ago. She had learned to fight, and she was ready for whatever came next. The following days were a whirlwind of tension and preparation. The letter had shaken Isabella, but she was determined not to let fear paralyze her. She knew she needed to act fast. Whatever this looming threat was, it was tied to her father's past, and she needed to uncover the details before it was too late. Victor had been uncharacteristically silent since their conversation. Isabella could sense his unease, but he wasn't sharing the full story. There was something he wasn't telling her, something deeper than the usual business deals gone wrong. After several attempts to get him to open up, Isabella decided to take matters into her own hands. She needed answers, And there was one person who might have them, an old family friend and business partner, Richard Donovan. Richard had been around when Thorne Enterprises was just starting to grow into the empire it was today. If anyone knew about the ghosts of her father's past, it was him. She arranged a meeting with Richard at a quiet cafe downtown, far from the eyes of the media or the company's inner circle. When she arrived, Richard was already there, sipping a cup of coffee, his gray hair neatly combed and his sharp eyes scanning the room. "Isabella," Richard greeted her with a warm smile as she approached. "It's been a while. Thank you for meeting me," Isabella said, taking a seat across from him. "I need your help." Richard's smile faded slightly, and he nodded. "I figured as much. I've been hearing rumblings about some difficulties at the company." Isabella sighed, her nerves on edge. "It's more than difficulties. There's something from my father's past, something dangerous that's resurfacing. I don't have all the details, but I received a letter warning me about a threat to the company. It's connected to old deals, things my father thought were buried." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Your father built Thorne Enterprises through hard work, but there were times where he had to make difficult decisions. Some of those decisions weren't always clean." "What kind of decisions?" Isabella pressed, her heart pounding. Richard hesitated before answering. "Back in the early days, when your father was still trying to establish the company's foothold in the real estate market, he partnered with some less than reputable figures. It was a different time, and the business world was cutthroat. Your father had to secure certain deals to survive, but those deals came with strings attached." Isabella's stomach dropped. "What kind of strings?" "Shady investments, partnerships with organizations that operated in the gray areas of the law," Richard explained, his voice lowering. "Your father eventually distanced himself from those people, but some of them never truly let go. They've been waiting, biding their time. And now, with the company in a vulnerable position after Anthony's scheme, they see an opportunity." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. "So they're coming after us now?" Richard nodded gravely. "It seems that way. Whoever sent you that letter is warning you that these figures are making their move. They want to leverage their past connections to either take control of the company or destroy it. They're playing for keeps." Isabella, her mind raced. She had thought that after Anthony's downfall, the company would be safe. But now, it was clear that the danger was far from over. If anything, it was even more serious. "What can I do?" Isabella asked, her voice laced with urgency. "You need to uncover everything," Richard said, leaning forward. "Find out who these people are and what they want. You'll need to bring the full truth to light, no matter how ugly it is. It's the only way to protect the company." Isabella nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes." Later that evening, Isabella met with her father again. She knew that if they were going to face this threat together, he needed to be honest with her. No more secrets. "Dad, I talked to Richard," Isabella said, her voice steady. "I know about the deals. I know there are people from the past who are trying to take advantage of the company's current situation." Victor sighed deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this. Why didn't you tell me?" Isabella asked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've been fighting to save this company, but I can't do that if I don't know what I'm up against." Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "I didn't want you to have to deal with this. It was my mistake, my burden to carry. But you're right. If we're going to fight this, you need to know the whole truth." He walked over to his desk and pulled out a small worn file. Inside were documents detailing the old partnerships and the shady deals he had made decades ago. Names, transactions, and contracts, everything was there. "These are the people who could destroy us," Victor said, handing the file to Isabella. "They have connections, influence, and they've been waiting for the right moment to strike." Isabella scanned the documents, her mind reeling. The names on the list were powerful, dangerous, and deeply embedded in the world of business and politics. If they were coming for the company, they wouldn't stop until they had taken everything. "We can't let them win," Isabella said, her voice firm. Victor nodded. "We won't, but it's going to take everything we've got." With the file in hand, Isabella and Victor began working around the clock to prepare for the coming storm. They started by securing the company's financials, tightening security around key projects and discreetly reaching out to trusted allies who could help them navigate the legal and political dangers they were about to face. Isabella's transformation from the naive, privileged woman she had once been to the strong, strategic leader she had become was now complete. She was no longer fighting just for her place in the company. She was fighting for its survival. One of the most important steps was to expose the truth. The shady figures from Victor's past had operated in the shadows for too long, using secrecy to protect their interests. Isabella knew that if they could shine a light on these hidden dealings, they could strip these enemies of their power. But it wouldn't be easy. Many of these individuals were powerful and well-connected. Bringing them down would require precise timing and a coordinated effort. Over the next few weeks, Isabella worked tirelessly to gather evidence, reaching out to old contacts and digging into the company's history. With every new piece of information she uncovered, the full scale of the threat became clearer. These weren't just disgruntled former partners. They were organized, dangerous, and willing to do whatever it took to reclaim their power. But Isabella wasn't alone. Janet, ever loyal, had been by her side throughout the entire ordeal. Her wisdom and steady hand helped guide Isabella through the emotional and strategic challenges ahead. The other janitors, who had once viewed Isabella with skepticism, now rallied behind her, offering support in unexpected ways. Carlos, the janitor who had provided the key evidence against Anthony, became an invaluable ally, using his connections within the working-class community to keep Isabella informed about any rumors or movements from their enemies. "We've got your back," Carlos told her one evening as they discussed the latest developments. "You're one of us now." Isabella smiled, grateful for support. It was a far cry from the isolated life she had lived before. She had finally found her place, not as an entitled heir, but as someone who understood the value of hard work, loyalty, and integrity. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. One morning, Isabella received an urgent message from one of their legal advisors. An attack on Thorn Enterprises was imminent. The enemies from Victor's past had mobilized, and they were planning to take the company down through a series of coordinated financial and legal strikes. But Isabella was ready. With the evidence she had gathered, she and Victor met with the authorities and key industry regulators, exposing the illegal deals and shady partnerships that had been hidden for years. The revelations sent shockwaves through the business world, and within days, several high-profile arrests were made. The enemies who had once seemed so powerful were now facing public disgrace and legal consequences. Thorn Enterprises, though battered, had survived the attack, and its reputation had been restored. As the dust settled, Isabella stood at the edge of the company's headquarters, looking out over the city. The battle was over, and she had emerged victorious, not just for the company, but for herself. Her father joined her, his expression one of quiet pride. "You've done it, Isabella. You've saved this company and everything we've built." Isabella smiled, but there was a peace in her heart that went beyond the victory. She had found her strength, her purpose. And though the future was still uncertain, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our work. We'd love to know what moment in the story impacted you the most. Let us know in the comments below. Also, we want to hear from you. If there's a story idea you'd like to see featured on the channel, leave your suggestions in the comments. Your feedback helps shape the stories we bring to life, so don't hesitate to share your thoughts. Thank you for being a part of our community.